The small fishing vessel, Seabird, looked like any other boat bobbing in the harbor of Port Wilson. Its weathered hull and modest size made it virtually invisible among the larger merchant ships and naval vessels that dominated the busy imperial port. No one paid any attention to the middle-aged captain, Frank Miller, as he went about his business, purchasing supplies and chatting casually with local fishermen. What the Imperial Harbor Guard failed to notice was that Frank wasn't really a fisherman. The nets hanging from the sides of his boat were rarely used, and the hold that should have contained fish was instead filled with something far more valuable: information. The year was 1887, and the Westland Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the world's landmass. For almost 2 centuries, its naval power had remained unchallenged, allowing it to maintain colonies across 3 continents. The empire's strength rested on its ability to move troops and supplies quickly across vast ocean distances, a capability that depended entirely on the security of its communication systems. Frank had once been a loyal naval officer in the imperial fleet, rising to the rank of lieutenant commander before a disagreement with his superiors led to his quiet dismissal. The official story claimed he had retired due to illness, but the truth was more complicated. Frank had questioned the empire's harsh treatment of local populations in the eastern colonies, voicing concerns that quickly made him unwelcome in military circles. Now, 10 years later, he had returned to imperial waters with a purpose that would have been unimaginable during his naval career. The Seabird carried hidden compartments beneath its floorboards, containing detailed maps of imperial shipping routes, naval codes, and fortress plans, all gathered through a network of sympathizers within the imperial ranks. Another day, another dollar, Frank mumbled to himself as he finished securing his boat for the evening. The harbor master walked past, giving him nothing more than a cursory nod. Perfect. Invisibility was his greatest asset. As darkness fell over Port Wilson, Frank lit a small lamp in his cabin and pulled out a coded message that had been slipped to him earlier that day by a dockworker. He carefully decoded it, revealing instructions for his next move: Northern Passage. 3 days. Blue Lighthouse. Midnight. Frank smiled. The resistance movement was growing stronger. What had begun as scattered acts of defiance in distant colonies had evolved into a coordinated network spanning thousands of miles. And his unassuming fishing boat was the key that connected them all. Tomorrow he would set sail again, carrying vital information that would eventually reach the hands of the colonial liberation forces. His unremarkable vessel, overlooked by imperial authorities, was slowly becoming the empire's greatest threat. The mightiest naval power in history would never suspect that its downfall would begin with a simple fishing boat named Seabird. Frank awoke before dawn, the gentle rocking of the Seabird a familiar comfort. He moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for departure while the harbor still slept. Only a few early-rising fishermen were visible in the misty morning light, none paying him any attention as he quietly readied his vessel. The Northern Passage mentioned in the coded message would take him through dangerous waters, not because of natural hazards, but because of the increased imperial patrols. The Empire's Third Naval Fleet had recently strengthened its presence along the northern trade routes after rumors of smuggling had reached the capital. If only they knew, Frank muttered to himself as he checked his compass. What he carried was far more dangerous than contraband goods. By mid-morning, the Seabird had cleared the harbor and was making steady progress northward. The wind was favorable, allowing Frank to maintain a respectable speed without drawing attention. From a distance, he appeared to be nothing more than another fisherman seeking better waters. As the coastline gradually transformed from the developed ports of the imperial heartland to the rockier shores of the northern territories, Frank kept a vigilant eye on the horizon. Imperial gunboats were known to stop and search vessels in these waters without warning or explanation. Around noon, he spotted the telltale smoke of an approaching steamship. Through his spyglass, he recognized the distinctive outline of an imperial patrol vessel. His heart quickened, but his face remained impassive. Frank casually adjusted his course, moving closer to a group of actual fishing boats that were working nearby. Blending in was his best defense. The patrol ship eventually passed at a distance, its officers apparently uninterested in the cluster of small fishing vessels. Frank released the breath he'd been holding. Another close call, but his ordinary appearance had protected him once again. By late afternoon, he had reached a small cove unmarked on official maps. Here, sheltered from both the sea and prying eyes, Frank dropped anchor and waited. This remote location served as one of many transfer points in the Resistance network. At dusk, a local boat approached, an old rowboat piloted by an elderly man. No words were exchanged as the man handed over a sealed oilskin packet. Frank merely nodded and passed him a similar package in return. Within minutes, the rowboat disappeared back toward shore, and Frank was once again alone. Under the dim light of his cabin lantern, Frank carefully opened the packet. Inside were updated naval schedules, information about troop movements, and, most valuable of all, a partial cipher key used by Imperial commanders in the eastern colonies. This intelligence would allow resistance leaders to anticipate the Empire's next moves and prepare accordingly. Frank memorized the key elements before destroying the most sensitive documents. The ashes were scattered into the sea, leaving no evidence of the exchange. The remaining papers were hidden in a waterproof container beneath a false panel in the ship's galley. That night, as he lay in his narrow bunk, Frank reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He remembered his days as an Imperial officer, how he had once believed in the Empire's mission to civilize the world. Those beliefs had crumbled slowly as he witnessed the brutal reality behind the Empire's grand rhetoric, the exploitation, the suppression of local cultures, the ruthless extraction of resources. The turning point had come during the Eastern Uprising 10 years ago, when he had been ordered to bombard a coastal village harboring suspected rebels. He had followed orders, only to discover later that the rebels had been unarmed civilians protesting Imperial land seizures. The guilt still haunted him. Not much longer now, he whispered to the darkness. Intelligence reports suggested that coordinated resistance movements were gaining momentum across multiple colonies. The Empire, stretched thin and increasingly reliant on outdated information, was beginning to lose its grip. Tomorrow would bring another day of sailing, another exchange of vital information, another small step toward the Empire's eventual collapse. And no one would ever suspect that an aging fisherman in a weathered boat played any role in the great events unfolding across the world. The blue lighthouse stood like a sentinel against the night sky, its beacon cutting through the darkness in regular, predictable flashes. Frank guided the seabird toward the rocky shoreline with careful precision, knowing that beneath the water's surface lay dangerous reefs that had claimed many vessels over the years. This remote outpost, technically part of the Empire but largely forgotten by Imperial authorities, served as an ideal meeting point. The lighthouse keeper, William, was one of the earliest members of the Resistance network, a former merchant sailor who had lost his family to Imperial justice when his wife had been accused of sympathizing with colonial rebels. As the seabird approached the small wooden dock beside the lighthouse, Frank could make out William's stocky figure waiting in the shadows. No lanterns were lit on the dock, another precaution against unwanted attention. "Been expecting you," William said quietly as Frank secured his boat. "You're cutting it close. Imperial scout ship passed by not 3 hours ago." "Had to take the long way around," Frank replied. "Patrol activity has doubled near the main shipping lanes." William nodded grimly. "That's why what you're carrying is more important than ever. Come inside quickly." The lighthouse interior was spartanly furnished but offered blessed warmth against the chill night air. William secured the door and drew the heavy curtains before lighting a small oil lamp. "The eastern colonies have begun coordinating their efforts," William explained, unfolding a detailed map on his table. "Your intelligence has confirmed what we suspected. The Empire has left the southeastern garrisons undermanned to strengthen their position in the west." Frank studied the map, noting the marked positions of Imperial strongholds. "They still don't realize the extent of the communication network we've established. They think each colonial uprising is isolated, disconnected. And that's their fatal mistake, William said with a hint of satisfaction. While their massive warships control the major ports, our little boats slip between the cracks, carrying the truth from colony to colony. Frank removed the waterproof package from inside his jacket. Latest cipher keys and patrol schedules. And something else, plans for the new Imperial fortress at Port Garson. William's eyes widened. How did you get these? Some Imperial officers have begun questioning their loyalties, Frank said simply. Not everyone in the Empire believes in what they're doing anymore. As the night deepened around the lighthouse, the two men continued planning the next phase of their quiet revolution, a revolution carried forward not by armies, but by ordinary people in unassuming boats like the Seabird. Dawn broke with ominous gray clouds gathering on the horizon. Frank studied the changing weather with a sailor's experienced eye as he prepared the Seabird for departure. Storm coming, William observed, helping to load the last of the supplies. Might want to delay until it passes. Frank shook his head. Can't afford to wait. The information needs to reach the Southern Resistance by the end of the week. He gestured toward the darkening sky. Besides, the Empire's patrol boats typically seek shelter during bad weather. Might be the safest time to travel. William handed Frank a sealed envelope. One more thing. Our contact in the Imperial Communications Office managed to copy this. It's the new emergency protocol for the Western Fleet. Frank tucked the envelope into his hidden pocket without comment. Both men understood its value. If the Resistance could anticipate the Empire's movements during a crisis, they could exploit the resulting confusion. Good luck, William said, stepping back onto the dock. The next contact will meet you at Red Cliff Harbor. Password is Summer Harvest. With a final nod to his ally, Frank set sail, guiding the Seabird away from the lighthouse and back into open waters. The wind was picking up, creating whitecaps that slapped against the hull. Most fishing boats were heading toward shore, seeking refuge from the approaching storm. The Seabird, however, moved steadily in the opposite direction. 3 hours later, the storm hit with full force. Rain lashed the deck while powerful waves tossed the small vessel about like a toy. Frank worked tirelessly, adjusting sails and steering to keep the boat from capsizing. His years at sea, both as an Imperial officer and later as a supposed fisherman, had prepared him for such challenges. Through sheets of rain, Frank spotted something that made his blood run cold, the unmistakable outline of an Imperial cruiser, its metal hull gleaming despite the storm. It was unusually close to shore for a vessel of its size, suggesting it might be pursuing something, or someone. Frank quickly changed course, using the storm as cover. The cruiser's powerful engines would give it speed, but the Seabird's smaller size offered maneuverability. In these turbulent conditions, that might make all the difference. As lightning split the sky, illuminating the churning sea around him, Frank gripped the wheel tighter. The game of cat and mouse had begun, with the humble Seabird carrying secrets that could ultimately bring down the mightiest navy in the world. The storm, he decided, would be his ally today. For 2 harrowing hours, Frank navigated through the storm's fury, using every trick he had learned in his decades at sea. The Imperial cruiser eventually disappeared from view, either losing track of the small fishing vessel or deciding that pursuing it through treacherous waters wasn't worth the risk. When the storm finally began to subside, Frank found himself in unfamiliar waters. The clouds had obscured the stars, making navigation difficult, but his compass indicated he had drifted far east of his intended course. He would need to correct his route before daybreak to reach Red Cliff Harbor on schedule. As the first hint of dawn colored the eastern sky, Frank spotted something floating in the water ahead. Drawing closer, he realized it was wreckage, splintered wood, torn fabric, and scattered personal belongings, all bearing the unmistakable markings of an Imperial supply ship. Poor souls, he murmured, scanning the area for survivors. The Empire often sacrificed its lower-ranking sailors, sending them out in dangerous conditions to maintain supply lines. A faint call for help caught his attention. Following the sound, Frank discovered a young man clinging to a broken spar, his Imperial uniform soaked and torn. Despite the risk, Frank couldn't ignore his duty as a seaman. He carefully maneuvered the seabird alongside the survivor and helped him aboard. "Thank you," the young sailor gasped, collapsing on the deck. "Our ship, the Storm. I think I'm the only one left." Frank provided the man with dry clothes and hot tea, watching him cautiously. This unexpected passenger complicated matters enormously. The secret documents hidden throughout the seabird could condemn Frank to death if discovered. "I'm James," the young sailor offered weakly. "Junior communications officer on the Imperial freight vessel Constant." "Frank Miller," he replied, revealing only his cover identity. "Just a fisherman caught in the same storm." James nodded gratefully, too exhausted to question why a fishing boat carried no nets or fish. "The Empire will reward you for saving one of their own," he said before drifting into an exhausted sleep. Frank watched the Imperial officer slumbering on his deck, mind racing with difficult choices. He could not risk being escorted to an Imperial port as a hero, not with what he carried. Yet his conscience wouldn't allow him to harm this innocent young man who had already survived one brush with death. The mission had just become infinitely more complicated, and Red Cliff Harbor was still a full day's journey away. James awoke near midday, still weak but more alert. He studied the small cabin of the seabird with growing curiosity. "Strange fishing boat you have," he observed, noticing the lack of equipment typically found on such vessels. "Where are your nets? Your catch?" Frank had prepared for this inevitable questioning. "Lost most of my gear in the storm," he explained smoothly. "Was heading back to port for repairs when I found you." The young officer seemed to accept this explanation, but Frank noticed his eyes wandering around the cabin, taking in details. Despite his youth, James had been trained to be observant, a dangerous quality in Frank's current situation. "We should reach land by tomorrow morning," Frank said, changing the subject. "There's a small fishing village where you can arrange transport back to an Imperial outpost." James nodded. "The Empire will be grateful." That supply ship was carrying important dispatches. A shadow crossed his face. "I was responsible for delivering coded messages to the Western Command. My failure will be noted." Frank felt a twinge of sympathy. He knew how the Empire treated those who failed in their duties, regardless of circumstances. "No one could have predicted that storm," he offered. "Even the most experienced captains would have struggled." As the day progressed, Frank became increasingly uneasy. James, recovering his strength, moved around the small boat with growing interest. Several times, Frank had to distract him from areas where documents were hidden. The situation reached a critical point when James accidentally knocked over a container in the galley, revealing a corner of the false panel Frank used for storage. "What's this?" James asked, his training as a communications officer making him instantly suspicious of hidden compartments. Frank's mind raced. He needed to act quickly before the young man discovered the truth. "Emergency supplies," he said casually. "Every sailor keeps some hidden reserves, just in case." James gave him a long look, uncertainty evident in his expression. You seem familiar somehow. Have we met before?" "I doubt it," Frank replied, keeping his voice steady. "I've been a simple fisherman all my life." But as he turned away to adjust their course, Frank could sense James's growing suspicion. The young officer's Imperial training was overcoming his gratitude for being rescued, and time was running out. Frank knew he would have to make a difficult decision before they reached Red Cliff Harbor, and soon. Night fell over the seabird, bringing with it a tense silence. Frank stood at the helm, guiding the vessel through calm waters while keeping one eye on James. The young Imperial officer had grown increasingly quiet throughout the evening, his initial gratitude now overshadowed by evident suspicion. "You know," James said finally, breaking the silence, "before joining the communications division, I studied naval history. There was a Lieutenant Commander Frank Miller who served with distinction before mysteriously retiring 10 years ago." He paused meaningfully. "They showed us his portrait during training as an example of exemplary service." Frank's grip tightened on the wheel, but his expression remained neutral. "A common name," he replied evenly. "I'm sure many Frank Millers have served the Empire." "Perhaps," James conceded, moving closer. "But how many would know exactly how to navigate these waters? Waters that aren't on any common fishing charts?" The confrontation Frank had been dreading had arrived. The young man was sharper than he had hoped. "Let me see what's in that hidden compartment," James demanded, his hand moving toward his belt where Frank knew Imperial officers typically carried a small sidearm. With a swift movement born from years of experience, Frank locked the wheel and spun around, catching James by surprise. "I can't let you do that, son." A brief struggle ensued, ending with both men breathing heavily, facing each other across the narrow deck. James had indeed been carrying a pistol, which now lay at Frank's feet. "You're him, aren't you?" James asked, anger and confusion mingling in his voice. "The officer who turned against his own empire. They tell stories about you at the academy, a cautionary tale about betrayal." Frank picked up the weapon and emptied its chambers into the sea. "Is that what they call it? Betrayal? Did they also tell you about the villages razed? The people displaced? The resources stolen?" James faltered, his certainty wavering. "We bring civilization, progress." "I believed that too, once," Frank said quietly. "Then I saw the truth." An unexpected shout from the water interrupted their confrontation. A small boat was approaching, flying the discreet signal of the resistance network. "You have a choice now," Frank told the young officer as the boat drew nearer. "You can remain loyal to an empire built on lies, or you can learn what I learned, the truth that's been hidden from you." James stared at the approaching boat, then back at Frank, his world suddenly turned upside down by the discovery that the infamous traitor had saved his life, and was now offering him a different path.